going on, guys? It is fucking noon here on day 4 in Vegas. I am kind of hungover, so getting a late start. I'm gonna head over to the Wynn for this one and play some 1-3, maybe some 2-5. Check out the games. Chris is over here being all like prepped and ready to go and shit, waiting on my fucking hungover ass to get up and...
Let's go.
Yeah, exactly. So, fuck it. Let's go play some poker. Alright guys, let's jump into this first hand. We are sitting in the hijack and we look down at ace-queen offsuit. Under the gun 1 is raised to $8 and action gets called all the way around the table. And we head off to a flop 7 ways of king, king, jack. Action checks around and on the turn comes the 8 of clubs. Under the gun now leads out for $40 and action folds around the table and we move on to the next hand. Moving on to this next hand, we are sitting in the middle position, and we look down at pocket aces. So we go ahead and we raise it up to $15, and the cutoff, the button, and the big blind all call. And we head off to a flop, which comes jack deuce 4, 2 diamonds. Action gets over to me, and I go ahead and I bet $45. The cutoff and the button fold, but the big blind calls, and we head off to a turn, which is the 3 of diamonds. Well, the front door flush just came in, but the big blind checks, and I go ahead and I check as well. And the river comes the king of clubs. The big blind now bets $65. I don't really see a reason to raise here because I don't think I'm really going to get value out of worse hands than what I'm holding. So I go ahead and I call. And the big blind just shows the ace of clubs. I flip over my aces, and we take down this pot. All right, guys, we are sitting in the under the gun 1 position, and we look down at pocket kings. I raise it to $15. The cutoff, the hijack, and the big blind all call, and we head off to a flop, which comes king, jack, jack. The big blind checks, I check, and then the hijack goes ahead and leads out for $40. The cutoff calls, the big blind folds, and now it's back to me, and with us having flopped such a monster, I'm kind of torn in this position. I definitely want my opponents to improve, but I also want to grow this pot a little bit. And I can't decide if just flat calling here and heading to a turn, or maybe putting in some kind of a min raise is the better option. The hijack's been a pretty aggressive player at this table since I sat down, doing a lot of raising pre-flop and raising very, very large over small opens from early position. So I feel like he might get aggressive if I just do a min click here. So that's exactly what I decide to do, and I go ahead and I raise it up to $80. The hijack goes into the tank now, and unfortunately ultimately decides on a fold after a while, but the cutoff goes ahead and calls. Turn comes the 4 of spades. The cutoff jams all in. I go ahead and I snap call, and the cutoff flips over 10-7 of spades for a turned flush. I flip over my pocket kings, we run out a brick on the river, and we go ahead and take down this pot. All right, moving on to this next hand, we are sitting in the under the gun 1 position again, and we look down at pocket queens. I go ahead and I open to $15, and the cutoff raises to $47. The small blind calls, and I decide to go ahead and 3-bet to $125, and both players call. So we head off to a flop, which comes king 3-3. Action goes ahead and checks around on this board, and the turn comes a 10. The big blind now jams for $75, and this is a pretty easy call, I think, for me. So I go ahead and I call. The cutoff folds. The river comes in 8. I flip over my pocket queens. The big blind looks back at their cards and then mucks, and we take down another big pot. All right, guys, moving on to this next hand. We've been running pretty hot in this session so far, and I think that might be getting to our heads just a little bit because we look down in the small blind at Jack Deuce of clubs. There's a raise to $11 from middle position. The hijack calls, I call, and Chris, who's now sitting to our direct left, also calls. So we head off to a flop, which comes 6-6-4, 2 clubs. Action goes ahead and checks around, and we head off to a turn, which is pretty favorable for us. It's the queen of clubs. I check, Chris checks, and the middle position player now bets $20. And the hijack calls, I call, and Chris calls as well. We head off to a river, which is the king of spades. I go ahead and I bet $25, and Chris folds. The middle position player calls, and the hijack folds. I flip over my turned flush, and the middle position player just taps the table and mucks his cards, and we take down this pot. Moving on to this next one, we are now under the gun 1 once again, and we look down at Queen Jack of clubs. There's a raise to $11 from the under the gun player, and I go ahead and I just call. The cutoff on the button also call, and we head off to a flop, which comes 5-6-6, 2 spades. Action checks around, and we head off to a turn, which comes a king. Action once again checks around, and we head off to a river, which is the jack of spades. Well, we made it to the river with second pair, but the front door flush gets there, and it's a paired board. So when action checks to me, I go ahead and check. The cutoff on the button check as well. I flip over my queen jack and say jack good, and everyone else mucks their cards, and we take down this pot. Moving on to this next hand, we're sitting under the gun now, and we look down at ace jack offsuit. We go ahead and limp, and action folds around to the big blind, who raises it to $25. I go ahead and I call. The under the gun 1 player calls, and the button calls, and we head off to a flop, which comes king 10-6, 2 hearts. Action checks over to the button now, who jams for $46. Well, I've got a straight draw and an overcard, so I figure we're probably pretty good. So I go ahead and I call. The other 2 players fold. I ask the button if they want to run it once or twice. They say twice. I go, all right. And the run out for the first board is the deuce of spades, 3 of clubs. And I'm like, you're probably good on that board. And the second board comes ace of diamonds, jack of clubs. So I run a run or 2 pair on the second board. I flip over my ace jack. And something interesting happens. The button flips over 7-8 offsuit and then just mucks their cards. So interesting jam there. Not entirely sure what they were doing, but I ended up taking down this pot. All right, guys, we're here at the Wynn. Took a break, stepped away from the table for a hot second, and we're running pretty good. So hopefully we can, keep that up. And table's pretty interesting. Sat down, had a Euro who was kind of blasting off there, and I ended up taking about 70% of his chip. So he's kind of steaming right now. So I think we're gonna go back and see if we can maybe get the rest of his stack. So yeah, let's see. You really want to do this right now? You bullshitting me? You trying to steal my money? Maybe I only got one over. King's too good.
6 players.
Sam, 1-3, Sam.
Check, check. Check, check, check. Five.
I'll be your hook, Barry. You gonna milk me? Is that what you're doing? You milking me right now? You milking me with your jack garbage? Is that what we're doing?
I always think of the Fockers when I hear that.
Jack garbage. Fuck you.
KY, 2-5 no limit hold KY. FY, 2-5 no limit hold FY.
Moving on to this next hand, we're sitting in the small blind now, and we look down at King 9 of diamonds. Action folds around to the button, who makes it $11, and we go ahead and call. The big blind folds, and we head off to a flop, which comes 3-5-9. I check, the button continues to bet for $11. I go ahead and I call with top pair OK kicker. We head off to a turn, which comes a 5. I check, the button checks again, and we head off to a river, which comes a king. I now decide that this is an opportunity to lead out for $12, and the button just folds, and we take down this pot. All right, guys, moving on to this next one, and this is going to be an interesting one, but probably not for the reason that you think. So we are sitting in the cutoff, and we look down at Ace 8 of spades. Action folds around to the low jack, who limps, and then the hijack raises to $15. I go ahead and I call, and Chris, who's sitting to my left on the button, also calls. The low jack calls as well, so we head off to a flop 4 ways. And the flop comes 7 of clubs, 10 of spades, 8 of clubs. The low jack checks, and the hijack bets big. The hijack bets $75. Well, we only flopped middle pair and a backdoor flush draw, but 4 ways, I don't think I'm in a really good shape. So I go ahead and I fold. And this is where it gets interesting. Chris starts shuffling his chips, trying to figure out what he wants to do. And before he can make a decision, the low jack calls the bet. So we call for the floor, and the floor comes over to make a ruling. And I'm going to hand the rest of this hand off to someone who had a little bit more of a stake in it. You know, although, like, so yeah, run us through that sevens hand real quick.
Yeah, so sevens hand, flop came, I think it was 10, 8, 7. 2 clubs, so I flopped a set of sevens, then lady bet got raised, and then she called before my action, which then made it really odd to what I do. So the ruling is that if I re-raise, she now has to, she can now get the choice. So I wanted to keep her 75 in, so flatted it. To keep her money in there, but then the turn was a 2 of clubs, if I recall correctly, which is an absolute disaster card, because that means, you know, probably one of them has got a flush now, and then she just rips it.
Like 167 or something like that?
So that was, it was a disaster. The guy folds, but she'd been ripping it pretty light on several occasions, which really did feed into that decision. So I tanked for a bit, ultimately called. I still had outs. if I was behind. And yeah, we river quads, so
Favorable river.
Doesn't get better than that, but we were ahead the whole time anyhow. So yeah, just finished out nicely and yeah, put me up quite a bit.
Randy, thank you.
How's that feel? Does that feel good? You happy? You happy now?
Back in the game.
Back in the game? Yeah? Give us a thumbs up, maybe? Yeah, okay.
All right, moving on to the last hand here. We are under the gun once again, and we look down at 5-4 of hearts. I go ahead and I raise it up to $6, and only the button calls. So we head off to a flop, which comes Queen 5-6, 2 diamonds. I bet $11, and the button calls, and we head off to a turn, which comes the Jack of clubs. I go ahead and I check, and the button checks, and we head off to a river, which comes the 5 of spades. So we river trips, and I decide to bet $35. The button thinks about this for a little bit and then ultimately makes the call, and I flip over my 4-5 and take down another pot. All right, that was probably the last interesting hand of this session, so we're going to go ahead and rack up and head over to an outro. All right, guys, that is going to wrap it up for the session here at the Wynn. Bought in for $1,000, cashed out for $1,819, so profit of $819. So pretty good win for me. Chris, how'd you do? How'd you do? Do you feel like you does it feel like you did good?
Yeah, so bought in for 400, came out for 730, so 330 up. Good session, very good tilt lesson, because I was tilting quite hard at one point and had to keep a lot of control over that in order to, you know, walk away with a couple of extra dollars.
Yeah, the degenerate over here, you know, needs to try and keep things on an even keel. So, all right, guys, that's gonna do it for this one. We'll see you in the next one. Peace.